You look at the podium, you look at the suits, and you look at the rhetoric coming out of Minneapolis today, and you have to ask yourself a very serious question about where this country is heading. We are witnessing something that goes far beyond a standard press briefing or a routine update on law enforcement operations, because what we saw from J.D. Vance wasn't just a policy announcement, it was a declaration of war on the very fabric of our communities. It was a chilling reminder that for the current administration, compassion is a weakness, and brutality is reframed as necessary order. We are standing on the precipice of a new era of enforcement that doesn't seek to solve problems but seeks to punish existence, and if you aren't paying close attention to the subtext of what happened in Minnesota, you might miss the warning signs of an authoritarian creep that is slowly becoming a sprint. Let's really unpack the scene, because context is everything when we are dealing with political theater of this magnitude. Minneapolis is a city that still bears the open wounds of historical trauma, a city that became the epicenter of a global movement for racial justice and police accountability not so long ago. When an administration sends its second-in-command to this specific location, it is a deliberate choice, a symbolic stake in the ground meant to signal to their base that they are here to take back territory, not to heal a divide. Vance, standing there, addressing a fatal shooting involving an ICE officer, didn't offer a single word of genuine mourning for the loss of life or a moment of reflection on why federal agents are engaged in lethal confrontations on our streets. Instead, he did what this brand of conservatism always does, which is to immediately pivot to a narrative of victimization where the armed agents of the state are the ones under siege. It is absolutely heartbreaking to watch the machinery of the federal government used to gaslight an entire populace. Vance stood there and aggressively defended the officer's actions as self-defense before any independent, transparent investigation has truly had time to settle into the public consciousness. This is the classic playbook of shielding power from accountability. By immediately framing the narrative as a heroic officer against a dangerous mob, he preemptively shuts down any legitimate questions about use of force, about de-escalation, and about why we continue to rely on militarized policing tactics in residential neighborhoods. They want you to believe that asking for justice is equivalent to inciting violence. They want you to believe that demanding police accountability is an act of radicalism. But the most insidious part of this press conference wasn't just the defense of the shooting, it was the weaponization of language against the media and advocacy groups. Vance blamed the so-called far left and the press for radicalizing citizens, a claim that is as dangerous as it is hypocritical. When leaders attack the free press and community organizers for misrepresenting facts, what they are really doing is trying to erase the witnesses. They are trying to create a reality where the only truth is the one that comes from the podium of the White House. It is a terrifying distortion of democracy when the people asking why did this happen are labeled as the instigators of chaos. This rhetoric is designed to isolate anyone who dissents, painting them not as concerned citizens exercising their First Amendment rights, but as enemies of the state who are responsible for the violence visited upon them. We have to talk about the specific policy bombshell that was dropped in the middle of this aggressive posturing, because it is going to change the legal landscape of this country in terrifying ways. Vance announced the creation of a new Assistant Attorney General position, a role specifically designed to aggressively prosecute those exploiting social services and those inciting violence against law enforcement. On the surface, to the casual observer, this might sound like upholding the law. But let's look at what this actually means in practice. This is the institutionalization of a crackdown on poverty and protest. By linking the exploitation of social services with violence against police in the same breath, they are conflating economic desperation with criminality. They are building a legal apparatus that will inevitably target immigrant communities, the working poor, and anyone who dares to stand on a picket line. This new position is essentially a federal prosecutor for culture war grievances. When they talk about prosecuting those who exploit social services, we know who they are talking about. They aren't talking about corporate welfare or tax loopholes for the billionaires who fund their campaigns. They are talking about the single mother trying to feed her kids, the immigrant family trying to navigate a labyrinthine asylum system, and the vulnerable populations that rely on the safety net to survive. To criminalize the navigation of these systems is a cruelty that is hard to overstate. It signals a shift from a government that tries to assist its people to a government that actively hunts for reasons to incarcerate them. And by pairing this with the prosecution of those inciting violence, they have created a catch-all category that can be used to sweep up political dissidents. We have seen this before in history, where vague definitions of incitement are used to silence legitimate political speech. If you organize a rally and someone throws a water bottle, under this new directive, are you now a target for a specialized assistant attorney general? This is the kind of chilling effect that silences democracy. It makes people afraid to speak up, afraid to gather, and afraid to demand better from their leaders. This is not about safety, it is about control. It is about creating a legal framework where the state has the power to crush opposition under the guise of maintaining order. And the fact that they are rolling this out in Minneapolis, a city with a rich history of progressive activism, is a direct threat to anyone who believes in the power of collective action. Then there is the attack on Governor Tim Walz. This was personal, and it was calculated. Dismissing Walz as an ineffective leader and suggesting he is complicit in welfare schemes is a blatant attempt to destabilize a democratic stronghold. Walz has governed with a philosophy of care, of ensuring that children are fed and that schools are funded, representing the very best of Midwestern progressive values. To accuse him of complicity in fraud is a desperate attempt to tarnish a record that stands in stark contrast to the cruelty of the current federal administration. They cannot win on the merits of their policies because their policies are unpopular and harmful, so they have to destroy the character of the men and women who offer a better alternative. This narrative that democratic leaders are running lawless cities is a myth that they have been peddling for years, despite all data to the contrary. It is a fearmongering tactic designed to scare suburban voters into voting against their own interests. Vance is trying to paint a picture of a dystopian hellscape that simply does not exist in the way he describes it, in order to justify the heavy hand of federal intervention. He talks about settling policy disputes at the ballot box, yet every action his administration takes seems designed to limit who can access that ballot box and whose voices are actually heard. It is the height of hypocrisy to call for democratic processes while simultaneously dismantling the institutions that make democracy possible. And let's not ignore the broader context of what Vance is saying about immigration fraud. This obsession with the idea that immigrants are stealing from the American people is the oldest, ugliest trick in the nativist playbook. It is designed to turn the working class against the poor, to make you blame the family fleeing persecution for your economic struggles instead of looking at the corporate greed that is actually keeping wages down. By announcing a federal crackdown on this supposed fraud, Vance is validating these hateful conspiracies. He is giving a federal stamp of approval to the idea that our neighbors are our enemies. It fosters an environment of suspicion and hatred where people are encouraged to turn on one another instead of building the solidarity we need to face our real challenges. The mention of Venezuela and Greenland in this briefing feels disparate, but it is all part of the same worldview. It is a worldview of domination. Whether it is military operations in Venezuela or the strategic acquisition of Greenland, the underlying philosophy is that the United States has the right to take what it wants and impose its will wherever it chooses. It connects back to the domestic policy because it is all about force. It is about the projection of power without moral consideration. When Vance talks about the strategic importance of Greenland, he isn't talking about climate change or the indigenous people who live there. He is talking about resources and military positioning. It is an imperialist mindset that treats the world as a chessboard and human beings as pawns. We are seeing a cohesive strategy here. The domestic crackdown on immigrants and protesters is the internal face of the same coin that drives aggressive foreign policy. It is a rejection of international law just as it is a manipulation of domestic law. They are trying to reshape the world in their image, an image that is hostile to diversity, hostile to dissent, and hostile to the very idea of a shared humanity. When they talk about national security, they mean the security of their power structure, not the security of the average family trying to put food on the table. In fact, their policies are making us all less safe by eroding the trust between communities and law enforcement, by destabilizing international relations, and by ignoring the root causes of the crises we face. You have to listen to the silence in Vance's speech as much as the words. What didn't he talk about? He didn't talk about the mental health crisis. He didn't talk about the need for police reform. He didn't talk about the root causes of migration. He didn't talk about the systemic racism that makes encounters with law enforcement so deadly for Black and brown Americans. This silence is an erasure. By refusing to acknowledge these realities, he is telling us that in his vision of America, these problems do not exist, or worse, that they do not matter. The only thing that matters is the enforcement of the status quo. The creation of this new Assistant Attorney General position is a sign that they are gearing up for a long fight. They are putting the personnel in place to wage a legal war against the progressive movement for years to come. This isn't a temporary measure, it is a structural change to the Department of Justice. They are politicizing the DOJ in a way that should alarm every single American, regardless of your party affiliation. The Justice Department is supposed to be the people's lawyer, not the president's sword. But Vance is making it clear that they view the legal system as a tool to punish their enemies and protect their friends. We need to see this press conference for what it truly is, a recruitment drive for a surveillance state. Vance is asking the public to buy into a narrative where their safety depends on the suspension of their neighbors' rights. He is asking us to trade our liberty for a false sense of security. And he is doing it with a calmness and a polish that makes it all the more dangerous. He isn't screaming, and he is legislating. He is bureaucratizing oppression. And that is why we have to push back now, before these new offices are staffed, before these new directives are written in stone, and before the narrative of law and order completely suffocates the cry for justice. The way he dismissed the shooting in Minneapolis is a microcosm of how they treat every tragedy. It's deflect, deny, and counterattack. There is no room for grief in their politics. There is only room for grievance. They feed on the anger of their base, stoking it with stories of dangerous cities and fraudulent immigrants, because they know that angry people are easier to manipulate. They don't want you to look at the man behind the curtain, and they want you to look at the desperate family crossing the border or the teenager holding a protest sign. They need you to be afraid of the powerless so that you don't notice what the powerful are doing to your future. As we look at the days ahead, we must remain vigilant. This announcement in Minneapolis is the testing ground. If they can normalize this level of rhetoric and this kind of legal overreach there, in one of the most progressive cities in the country, they will take it everywhere. They will bring this Assistant Attorney General for Culture Wars to every state, every city, and every town. We are witnessing the rollout of a strategy designed to break the back of the progressive movement, and our only defense is to refuse to be divided, to refuse to be afraid, and to relentlessly speak the truth about what is happening to our democracy. You have to understand that when J.D. Vance stands there and blames the media and far-left groups for radicalizing citizens, he is engaging in a very specific, very dangerous type of projection. He knows, just as well as we do, that the most radicalizing force in American life right now isn't a cable news segment or a community newsletter, it is the lived reality of inequality that his party refuses to address. People aren't angry because a journalist told them to be angry, and people are angry because they are working 2 jobs and still can't afford rent, or because they watched a video of a police officer kneeling on a man's neck and saw no immediate justice. To blame the messenger is to deny the message, and that is precisely the strategy here. If you can convince the public that the people reporting on the fire are the arsonists, you never have to answer for why you built the house out of kindling. This rhetoric against the press is designed to insulate the administration from any form of scrutiny, effectively creating a permission structure for their supporters to ignore any fact that doesn't fit their worldview. We are moving into a post-truth political landscape where loyalty is valued over literacy, and where questioning an official government narrative is treated as an act of betrayal. When Vance dismisses legitimate reporting as misrepresentation, he is trying to bully news organizations into silence. He wants a press corps that acts as stenographers for power, repeating press releases verbatim, rather than journalists who dig for the truth. This is how democracies die, not always in the dark, but in the glaring light of a podium where the truth is openly mocked by those in charge. Let's pivot back to Governor Tim Walz because the attacks on him are incredibly revealing about the Republican psyche right now. They aren't attacking Walz because he's failing, they are attacking him because, by their standards, he is dangerously successful at showing what progressive governance looks like. Minnesota under Walz has become a laboratory for democracy, passing paid family leave, protecting reproductive rights, and ensuring free school meals for every child. This is the radical agenda Vance is so afraid of, the radical idea that government should actually improve people's lives. By trying to tie Walz to welfare schemes, Vance is desperate to muddy the waters, to make people forget that Minnesota is outperforming many Republican-run states on almost every metric of quality of life. The accusation of being complicit in fraud is a classic smear tactic, devoid of evidence but rich in implication. It's meant to generate sound bites for attack ads, to associate a decent, Midwestern dad figure like Walz with corruption and criminality. It is a cynical attempt to break the bond of trust between a governor and his constituents. They know they can't win an argument on whether children should eat, so they have to shift the argument to whether the administration is corrupt. It is a distraction, plain and simple, meant to divert eyes from the fact that the Republican platform offers absolutely nothing to the working families of Minnesota except tax cuts for their bosses and culture wars for their news feeds. And while we are talking about distraction, we have to look deeper at this narrative of social services exploitation. This is one of the most pernicious myths in American politics, the idea of the welfare queen reimagined for the 21st century. Vance is tapping into a deep well of racial resentment, suggesting that undeserving people, read immigrants and minorities, are looting the treasury while real Americans suffer. It is a lie. The data consistently shows that fraud in these programs is minuscule compared to the rampant tax evasion by the wealthy or the wage theft committed by corporations. But you will never hear Vance announce a new assistant attorney general to prosecute wage theft or to crack down on offshore tax havens. Instead, they punch down. They target the most vulnerable people in our society because they can't fight back. When they talk about aggressive prosecution of benefit fraud, what that looks like on the ground is terrorizing poor families. It looks like cutting off food stamps because of a paperwork error. It looks like raiding the homes of grandmothers who might be caring for a grandchild not listed on a lease. It is the weaponization of bureaucracy to enforce a rigid social hierarchy. It tells us that in their eyes, poverty is a moral failing, and seeking help from the government is a suspicious act that warrants investigation. This brings us back to that new Assistant Attorney General position, which I truly believe is the most alarming takeaway from this entire press conference. We need to be very clear about what this role represents. It is the institutionalization of the mega grievance movement within the Department of Justice. By explicitly linking the exploitation of social services with inciting violence against law enforcement, they are creating a legal bridge to prosecute political enemies. Imagine a scenario where a community organization provides bail funds for protesters. Under this new mandate, could that be construed as exploiting services to incite violence? The ambiguity is the point. The vagueness of the charge allows for selective enforcement, giving them a hammer to smash any organization that challenges their power. We are looking at the potential criminalization of mutual aid. In recent years, we've seen communities come together to fill the gaps left by the state, feeding their neighbors and supporting activists. This resilience threatens the authoritarian model because it proves we don't need their iron fist to be safe, we need each other. So, they invent a position designed to tear these networks apart. They want to make it legally risky to help your neighbor. They want to freeze the bank accounts of nonprofits and tie up activists in court battles for years. This is lawfare, warfare conducted through the legal system, and it is being deployed to dismantle the infrastructure of the progressive movement. Now, let's widen the aperture to the international comments Vance made, specifically about Venezuela and Greenland. It is easy to dismiss these as side notes, but they are crucial to understanding the holistic worldview of this administration. The mention of military operations in Venezuela is a dog whistle for regime change and interventionism. It speaks to a desire to reassert American dominance in the hemisphere through force rather than diplomacy. It is the same muscular, aggressive posture they use on the streets of Minneapolis, just exported to a global stage. They view international relations not as a community of nations but as a series of targets to be subdued or resources to be acquired. The Greenland comment is even more telling in its naked transactionalism. Remember when the previous Republican leader wanted to buy Greenland? Vance bringing up its strategic importance suggests that this absurdity is actually serious policy for them. They look at a sovereign territory, home to indigenous people and a fragile ecosystem, and they see a military base and a mine. It is the ultimate expression of colonialist thinking. They don't care about the self-determination of the people who live there, they only care about how that land can serve the imperial ambitions of the United States. It is a mindset that treats the entire planet as property to be seized. This connects directly to the environmental justice aspect of our struggle. You cannot separate the exploitation of land from the exploitation of people. The same ideology that says it's okay to drill in the Arctic regardless of the climate cost is the same ideology that says it's okay to militarize the border regardless of the human cost. It is a philosophy of extraction, take what you want, leave the mess for someone else, and use force to silence anyone who complains. Vance is the smooth-talking salesman for this brutal worldview, wrapping policies of devastation in the language of national security. We must also scrutinize the timing of this violence against law enforcement narrative. Crime rates have been fluctuating, but the narrative of a war on cops is largely a fabrication used to justify increased police budgets and decreased accountability. Being a police officer is a difficult job, yes, but statistically, it is not the most dangerous job in America, not by a long shot. Loggers, roofers, and delivery drivers face higher mortality rates. Yet, we don't see assistant attorneys general appointed to prosecute those who create unsafe working conditions for roofers. We elevate the protection of the state's enforcers above the protection of the citizens themselves, creating a special class of victimhood for the police that is used to shield them from the consequences of their actions. This elevation of the police to a protected, untouchable class is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. When you make it a special federal crime to incite against them, with a definition of incitement that is likely to be incredibly broad, you are effectively outlawing criticism of the state. If I stand on a corner and chant "defund the police," is that incitement? If I post a video of police brutality online, is that incitement? These are not hypothetical questions. These are the legal battles we are about to face. Vance is laying the groundwork to treat political speech as a criminal act, and he is using the emotional weight of a tragedy to push this through before anyone can read the fine print. The focus on Minneapolis is also a strategic choice to continually re-traumatize a community that has already been through so much. They keep picking at the scab. They want Minneapolis to be a symbol of chaos so they can present themselves as the bringers of order. But the order they bring is the silence of the graveyard. It is an order maintained by fear, by prisons, and by deportation forces. Real order, the kind that lasts, is built on justice. It is built on trust. It is built on the knowledge that if you work hard, you can survive, and if you are in trouble, the state will help you, not hunt you. Vance's vision is the opposite of the American dream, it is the American nightmare. It is a vision where your neighbor is a potential fraudster, where the news anchor is a liar, where the governor is a crook, and where the only person you can trust is the man with the badge and the gun. It is a deeply cynical, lonely, and paranoid way to view the world. And it is exhausting. They want to wear us down with this constant barrage of threats and enemies. They want us to get so tired of fighting for the truth that we just give up and let them have their way. But we cannot give up. We have to look at this press conference and see it for the roadmap that it is. They are telling us exactly what they are going to do. They are going to use the Department of Justice to harass their opponents. They are going to use the bully pulpit to demonize immigrants. They are going to use foreign policy to expand military reach. And they are going to use the media as a punching bag to inoculate their base against reality. Knowing their plan is the first step to defeating it. We have to be smarter, we have to be louder, and we have to be more organized than they are. We need to talk about the far-left label again because it is such a lazy, effective slur. By painting anyone who wants healthcare or police reform as far-left, they shift the Overton window so far to the right that moderation looks like extremism. They are trying to make basic human empathy seem like a radical political stance. We have to reject this framing. Caring about your neighbors isn't radical. Wanting police to obey the law isn't radical. Wanting a government that works for everyone, not just the wealthy, isn't radical. It is American. It is the promise of this country that they are trying to break. And let's not forget the sheer hypocrisy of a party that claims to support small government while creating new federal positions to police local communities. They shout about states' rights when it comes to taking away a woman's right to choose, but the moment a state like Minnesota chooses to feed its children or protect its immigrants, suddenly they need a federal assistant attorney general to intervene. They don't believe in small government, they believe in their government. They believe in state power when they wield it, and they believe in anarchy when they don't. The mention of the ballot box at the end of Vance's speech was the ultimate gaslight. Settle it at the ballot box, he says, while his party passes voter suppression laws, gerrymanders districts to oblivion, and purges voter rolls. They want you to believe the game is fair while they are actively tilting the table. They know that if every eligible American voted, their ideology would be swept into the dustbin of history. So they rely on apathy. They rely on people thinking that both sides are the same or that my vote doesn't matter. Vance's speech was designed to deepen that cynicism. We have to strip away the suit and the tie and the polished delivery and see the raw power grab underneath. This wasn't a briefing, it was a threat. It was a threat to the free press, a threat to immigrant communities, a threat to progressive leaders, and a threat to the rule of law itself. But threats only work if you are afraid. And looking at the history of Minneapolis, looking at the resilience of the American people, I don't think we are as afraid as J.D. Vance hopes we are. We see through the fog. We see the game. And we are ready to play it differently. Let's dig deeper into the psychology of what Vance is selling here, specifically regarding this obsession with immigration fraud. We need to be incredibly clear-eyed about what this phrase actually signals. When they talk about fraud in the context of immigration, they aren't talking about paperwork errors or bureaucratic mishaps. They are constructing a narrative of the thief. They are telling the American worker, whose wages have stagnated for 40 years not because of immigrants but because of corporate greed, that the reason they are struggling is because someone with a different accent is stealing their slice of the pie. It is the politics of scarcity. It is a lie designed to make us fight over crumbs while the donor class runs away with the bakery. By prioritizing the prosecution of this so-called fraud, Vance is effectively criminalizing the survival strategies of the desperate. Imagine a family that has fled violence, traveled thousands of miles, and is now trying to navigate a system designed to fail them. If they make a mistake, or if they rely on a community network that the government deems suspicious, they are now targets for a federal prosecutor. This isn't justice, it's a trap. It's a way to retroactively justify mass deportations by labeling everyone a criminal. If you can paint every asylum seeker as a fraudster, then you don't have to treat them as a human being with rights. You can treat them as a contaminant to be removed. And think about the chilling effect this has on legal immigrants and naturalized citizens. When the government announces a crusade against immigration fraud, it casts a shadow of suspicion over every brown and black face in this country. It emboldens the bad actors in our society, the discriminatory landlord, the biased boss, the nosy neighbor, to act as vigilante extensions of the state. It tells them that their prejudice is actually patriotism. We are creating a society where people are afraid to access healthcare, afraid to send their kids to school, and afraid to report crimes to the police because they fear that any interaction with the state could lead to their destruction. That doesn't make communities safer. It creates zones of lawlessness where predators can operate with impunity because their victims are too terrified to speak up. Now, look at the specific juxtaposition of this crackdown with the defense of the ICE officer. This is the double standard that defines modern American conservatism. For the immigrant, the slightest infraction is met with the full crushing weight of the federal government. For the state agent who takes a life, there is instant exoneration, framed as self-defense before the body is even cold. Vance's rush to defend the shooter is a signal to every law enforcement officer in the country: do what you want. We will protect you. We will spin the story. We will blame the victim. It removes the most basic check on police power, which is the fear of consequences. This is particularly galling in Minneapolis. This city knows the cost of police impunity. To come here and double down on the hero cop narrative without acknowledging the deep, justified mistrust the community feels is an act of supreme arrogance. It's gaslighting on a municipal scale. They are telling the people of Minneapolis that their eyes are lying to them, that their trauma is invalid, and that the real victims are the guys in the tactical gear. It's a deliberate provocation. They want a reaction. They want people to get angry and take to the streets so they can point the cameras at the fire and say, "See? We told you they were savages." It is a cycle of provocation and repression that they manage like a stage production. We also have to talk about the far-left label again, because Vance uses it as a catch-all for anything that threatens the status quo. But let's look at who he's actually attacking. When he attacks the far-left in Minneapolis, he's attacking the teachers' unions who are fighting for smaller class sizes. He's attacking the nurses who are demanding safe staffing ratios. He's attacking the community groups that hand out groceries in food deserts. By lumping all these acts of care and solidarity under the banner of radicalism, he is trying to make compassion toxic. He is trying to sever the bonds of community that hold us together. This is where the attack on Governor Walz becomes so significant. Walz represents a model of leadership that is fundamentally threatening to the mega brand of masculinity. Vance performs a type of masculinity that is cold, rigid, and aggressive, that suit and tie authoritarian who commands from above. Walz, on the other hand, projects a masculinity that is rooted in service: the coach, the teacher, the neighbor. Walz's leadership says that strength is found in lifting people up, not putting them down. It says that feeding school children is a strength, not a handout. The Republicans hate this because it exposes their toughness for what it really is, bullying. They can't stand the fact that a progressive agenda can be popular, practical, and Midwestern. They have to destroy Walz because he proves that you don't have to be a monster to be a strong leader. The accusation that Walz is complicit in welfare schemes is a projection of their own corruption. We are talking about a party that passed a tax bill which was essentially a $1 trillion heist for the ultra-wealthy. They have gutted regulations to allow corporations to poison our air and water to save a few cents on the dollar. That is the real fraud. That is the real looting of America. But they will never appoint an assistant attorney general to go after the CEO who dumps toxic waste or the banker who forecloses on families illegally. No. They reserve the handcuffs for the single mom who works off the books to buy diapers. The cruelty is the point. It is a performance of power meant to remind the working class of their place. Let's expand on the Assistant Attorney General for those inciting violence concept, because the legal implications are terrifying. Who gets to define inciting? In the history of this country, simply being black and demanding rights was considered inciting violence. Organizing a labor strike was considered inciting violence. This language is a blank check for political persecution. It suggests that they are looking for the intellectual authors of dissent. If you write an article criticizing the police and someone reads it and throws a rock, are you now liable? This is an attack on the First Amendment that is disguised as public safety. It is an attempt to freeze the marketplace of ideas so that the only voice that can be heard without fear is the voice of the state. And notice the international context again, Venezuela. Why Venezuela? Why now? It's the specter of socialism. They use Venezuela as a scarecrow to frighten Americans away from progressive economic policies. If you tax the rich, we'll turn into Venezuela. It's a tired, lazy argument, but by linking it to a military operation, Vance elevates the threat level. He's suggesting that the socialist threat is not just economic, but physical, that it requires a military response abroad and a police response at home. It conflates domestic political opponents with foreign enemies, which is a classic hallmark of fascism. It justifies treating your own citizens as enemy combatants. The strategic importance of Greenland is another piece of this puzzle. It represents the commodification of the natural world. To the progressive mind, the Arctic is a vital, fragile regulator of the global climate, a place that needs protection for the sake of all humanity. To the Vance mindset, it is simply real estate. It's a place to put missiles and drill for oil. This worldview, that the Earth is just a warehouse of stuff to be taken, is exactly what has led us to the climate crisis. And notice, there was zero mention of climate change in his briefing. Not a word. In their world, the melting ice caps aren't a warning, and they are a business opportunity. It's a level of myopia that is frankly suicidal. But let's bring it back to the human element. Think about the message this sends to the children of Minneapolis. If you are a child of color growing up in that city, watching the Vice President of the United States stand on a podium and defend the person who might shoot you, and attack the people trying to protect you, what does that do to your soul? It tells you that you don't matter. It tells you that your life is less valuable than the preservation of order. We are inflicting a deep psychological wound on an entire generation. We are teaching them that the government is their enemy. And then, when that trauma manifests as anger or despair, Vance will be there to call it radicalization and send in the prosecutors. This is the cycle they rely on. They break the system, they break the people, and then they campaign on fixing the mess they made by breaking it even further. They create the chaos they claim to abhor. By refusing to hold police accountable, they ensure that protests will continue. By refusing to fix the immigration system, they ensure that the border remains a flashpoint. They need the crisis. Without the crisis, they have no platform. If things were calm, if people were fed, if justice was being served, what would J.D. Vance talk about? He has no vision for a happy America. He only has a map of who to blame for an unhappy one. We need to realize that this Assistant Attorney General position is likely just the tip of the iceberg. It's a pilot program. If they get away with this in the Department of Justice, where else will they apply this logic? Will we see a Department of Education official dedicated to prosecuting teachers who teach divisive concepts? Will we see a Department of Health official targeting doctors who provide gender-affirming care? Once you accept the premise that the federal government's role is to enforce a specific cultural orthodoxy through criminal law, there is no stopping point. We are watching the transformation of the executive branch into a culture war enforcement agency. And we must confront the settle it at the ballot box rhetoric with the reality of what they are doing to the ballot box. In states across the country, Republicans are making it harder to vote. They are removing drop boxes, shortening early voting hours, and imposing strict ID laws that disproportionately affect the poor and elderly. They are gerrymandering districts so aggressively that politicians choose their voters, not the other way around. So when Vance says vote, he says it with a smirk. He knows the deck is stacked. He knows that in a fair fight, his ideas lose. So he is daring us to try and win in a system he is actively rigging. It's not an invitation to democracy, it's a taunt. However, we should not take this taunt as a reason to despair. We should take it as a reason to organize harder. The fact that they are going to these lengths, creating new positions, holding high-profile press conferences, attacking local governors, shows that they are afraid. They are afraid of the coalition that is building. They see the unions winning contracts. They see the young people demanding climate action. They see the multiracial democracy that is emerging, and it terrifies them. This crackdown isn't a sign of their strength, it's a sign of their panic. They know their time is running out. They know that the demographics and the values of this country are shifting away from them. So, what do we do with this information? We have to control the narrative. We cannot let Vance write the history of this moment. When he says fraud, we must say survival. When he says mob, we must say community. When he says self-defense, we must say accountability. We have to be relentless in translating their doublespeak into plain English. We have to explain to our neighbors, our families, and our co-workers that this isn't about law and order, it's about power and control. We also need to protect Governor Walz and leaders like him. Not because they are perfect, but because they are the firewall. If they can take down a popular, effective Democratic governor in a blue state using federal lawfare, no one is safe. We need to rally behind leaders who show a spine, who refuse to kiss the ring. We need to show that attacks like this backfire. Instead of weakening Walz, this should galvanize his support. It should make us realize how important it is to have local leaders who will stand up to federal bullying. Finally, we need to refuse the bait. Vance wants violence. He wants footage of burning buildings to run in his campaign ads. He wants to prove that liberal cities are war zones. The most radical thing we can do is to be disciplined, to be strategic, and to build power without giving them the excuse they are begging for. We fight them in the courts, we fight them in the voting booths, we fight them in the court of public opinion, but we do not let them drag us down into the mud where they live. The stakes of this press conference are incredibly high. It is a preview of a second term, a manifesto for a surveillance state. But it is also a clarifying moment. The lines are drawn. On one side, a vision of America defined by suspicion, punishment, and hierarchy. On the other, a vision defined by solidarity, care, and equality. J.D. Vance has made his choice. He has chosen to stand with the gun and the gavel. Now we have to make ours. We have to stand with the people. And we have to believe that the people, when united, are stronger than any assistant attorney general they can invent. This is where we have to connect the dots between the domestic policy of cracking down and the foreign policy of taking over. When Vance casually discusses the strategic importance of Greenland or military operations in Venezuela in the same breath as policing American streets, he is revealing the architecture of an empire that sees no borders to its aggression. The logic is seamless. If you can send the military to Caracas to restore order or secure resources, why can't you send federal agents into Minneapolis to do the same? They are eroding the distinction between the military and the police, between foreign adversaries and domestic citizens. We are witnessing the homecoming of the imperial boomerang. The tactics used abroad to suppress populations are now being deployed against us, right here, in our own neighborhoods. Think about the sheer audacity of creating a federal post specifically to prosecute incitement. In the digital age, what does incitement even look like to a prosecutor looking to make a name for himself? Is sharing a video of police misconduct incitement? Is tweeting a location for a protest incitement? Is donating to a bail fund incitement? By leaving the definition intentionally vague, they create a panopticon where every citizen has to self-censor for fear of federal retribution. It is the ultimate tool for chilling free speech. They don't have to arrest everyone, they just have to arrest enough people to make the rest of us too scared to hit post. They are building a digital iron curtain, not to keep information out, but to keep dissent in check. And let's return to the attack on Governor Walz because it is the clearest example of the burn it down strategy. Walz represents the Minnesota miracle, a state that decided to tax the rich and invest in the people. And guess what? It worked. The economy in Minnesota is strong, people are happier, and kids are fed. This success is an existential threat to the Republican worldview. If a Democrat can show that progressive policies actually make life better for normal people, the entire mega argument collapses. They need Walz to fail. They need Minnesota to be a hellhole. So, When reality doesn't cooperate, they invent a reality where he is a criminal accomplice to fraud. It is character assassination as political strategy, and it is desperate. The welfare fraud narrative is also a strategic attempt to defund the safety net by 1,000 cuts. They know that openly repealing food stamps or housing assistance is political suicide. So instead, they wrap it in the guise of fighting fraud. They create so much red tape, so many verification requirements, and such a high threat of prosecution that people simply drop out of the system. They want to make being poor so bureaucratically hazardous that people give up on seeking help. It is a form of administrative violence. They are trying to starve the beast, but in this case, the beast is a hungry child in St. Paul or a disabled veteran in Duluth. We must also confront the racial coding of this entire press conference. When Vance talks about law and order, he is singing from the old Nixon songbook, but with a modern, darker harmony. He is speaking to a specific slice of white suburbia, telling them that their safety is threatened by the others, the immigrants, the black protesters, the urban poor. He is selling them a false promise of security that can only be purchased by giving up their neighbors' civil rights. It is a transaction built on prejudice. He is betting that enough Americans are willing to look the other way while the state tramples on the rights of minorities, as long as the state promises to keep the chaos away from their manicured lawns. But here is the truth they don't want you to know, that their policies cause the chaos. When you cut funding for mental health, you get more people in crisis on the street. When you militarize the police, you get more violent confrontations. When you destabilize foreign nations like Venezuela, you get more refugees at the border. They are the arsonists complaining about the smell of smoke. Every crisis Vance pointed to in his speech is a crisis exacerbated by the very ideology he promotes. They break the world and then demand absolute power to fix it. It is a protection racket on a geopolitical scale. The mention of Greenland is particularly dystopian. It treats a living, breathing ecosystem as nothing more than a strategic asset on a risk board. In a world on fire from climate change, the only reason Greenland is becoming more strategic is because the ice is melting, opening up new shipping lanes and drilling sites. Instead of mourning the loss of the cryosphere, they are salivating over the profits. It is a mindset so consumed by greed and power that it views planetary collapse as a business opportunity. This is the leadership they offer, and not a plan to save the world, but a plan to be the last one standing on the ashes. We have to ask ourselves, where does this end? If they establish this assistant attorney general for inciting violence, and if they successfully demonize the opposition as radicals and fraudsters, what is the next step? We don't have to guess. We just have to look at history. The next step is the criminalization of the opposition party itself. The next step is the use of the DOJ to determine who is allowed to run for office. We are sliding toward a form of managed democracy like we see in Russia or Hungary, where elections happen, but the outcome is predetermined by who is in jail and who controls the media. Vance is the smooth, Yale-educated avatar of this slide. He makes the end of democracy sound like a reasonable policy adjustment. But we are not helpless. In fact, their aggression is a sign of our potential power. They are attacking the progressive movement because they know it is the only force capable of stopping them. They are attacking unions, community groups, and organizers because those are the engines of change. Our job now is to protect those engines. We need to build a wall of solidarity around the people they target. If they come for the immigrants, we must all be immigrants. If they come for the protesters, we must all be protesters. We cannot let them pick us off one by one. The settle it at the ballot box line is a trap, but it is also a challenge we must accept, not on their terms, but on ours. We need to overwhelm their suppression with sheer numbers. But voting is the floor, not the ceiling. We need to build power between elections. We need to build institutions that don't rely on the permission of the federal government to exist. We need mutual aid networks that can feed people when the state cuts them off. We need legal defense funds that can protect activists when the DOJ comes knocking. We need independent media that can tell the truth when the mainstream press bows to pressure. J.D. Vance stood there for an hour and outlined a nightmare. But dreams are stronger than nightmares. The dream of a multiracial democracy, where everyone has a seat at the table, where care is valued over control, and where justice is real, not just a word on a building, that dream is still alive. It is alive in the streets of Minneapolis. It is alive in the classrooms of Minnesota. It is alive in the hearts of millions of Americans who refuse to buy what Vance is selling. They want us to be cynical. They want us to look at that podium and think, it's over, they won. But it is not over. It is just beginning. This press conference was the opening salvo of a battle for the soul of this nation. And looking at the history of this country, from the abolitionists to the suffragettes to the civil rights marches, I know one thing for sure, the people who want freedom are always stronger than the people who want control. The road ahead is going to be hard. It is going to be scary. But we walk it together. And because we walk it together, we will win. This isn't just about J.D. Vance or Tim Walz. This is about us. It's about who we are and who we want to be. Do we want to be a nation of snitches and soldiers, ruled by fear? Or do we want to be a nation of neighbors and citizens, ruled by hope? The choice is stark. The time is short. Let's get to work.